The narrative arc of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, from a privileged but physically frail Boston Brahmin to the 35th President of the United States, is incomprehensible without first acknowledging the titanic influence of his father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. Joe Sr.'s own thwarted political ambitions were surgically transferred to his progeny, crafting a dynasty as an instrument of his will. The creation of a Kennedy on the American throne was a calculated, decades-long, and ruthlessly executed business plan built upon immense wealth derived from often morally ambiguous dealings. This wealth and outsider status fueled Joe Sr.'s drive for dominion, a goal originally fixed on his eldest and most politically promising son, Joseph Jr. Jack, the second son, was initially destined for a secondary role, interested more in academia and high society life than the brutal grind of politics. His father's ambition, however, was a birthright and a command. Jack's initial run for Congress in 1946 was an assignment, a campaign funded and precisely orchestrated by the senior Kennedy. This reluctant candidacy was a dry run for the main event, a necessary stepping stone in a master plan that was not his to question, and one which would soon be irrevocably altered by fate. The transition of the political burden from Joe Jr. to Jack would be the single most defining event of Jack's trajectory, transforming a comfortable secondary role into a demanding central one. The true political career of John F. Kennedy began not from a personal calling, but from the shadow of his elder brother's destiny and the unyielding pressure of a father determined to fulfill his own failed aspirations through his surviving son. The ruthless efficiency with which Joe Sr. controlled the narrative, ensuring that Jack's war heroism was amplified to legendary status, established the pattern of image management that defined his path to the White House.
Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support, especially clicking that little notification bell, is the rocket fuel that allows us to continue bringing you deeply researched, narrative-driven history and analyses that seek to reveal the true complexity behind the myths of towering figures like JFK. Every single like and share helps us break through the noise and build the ultimate educational resource on YouTube. By engaging with our content, you are directly contributing to a community dedicated to historical understanding and critical thinking. Don't let this history disappear into the digital abyss. Take a moment to hit the thumbs up button and spread the knowledge to others who appreciate deep dives into the figures who shaped the modern world. Your action is our validation, and it ensures that the vital stories of figures like Kennedy continue to be told with the nuance and depth they deserve.
The single tragic explosion that shattered the meticulously laid dynastic plans of the Kennedy patriarch occurred on August 12, 1944. That day, Joe Kennedy Jr., the intended political heir groomed for the White House, perished in the skies over the English Channel. He was piloting an explosive-laden U.S. Navy bomber on a highly hazardous, clandestine mission as part of Operation Aphrodite. His plane detonated prematurely, leaving no survivors and instantly creating a vacuum at the apex of the Kennedy ambition. This catastrophe did not lead Joe Sr. to abandon his project. On the contrary, it intensified his focus, but it necessitated the swift and brutal transfer of the entire dynastic burden onto the shoulders of his second son, John. This was a destiny Jack had never sought, and one that his frail physical condition made all the more daunting. The psychological weight of this transfer was immense. Jack not only had to succeed in politics, but had to do so as a stand-in for his heroic deceased brother, a ghost he would forever be measured against. The burden was not simply an expectation of victory. It was a moral, filial obligation to fulfill his father's destiny, a responsibility he accepted with a characteristic blend of duty and cynicism. He was now the indispensable piece in a high-stakes, multi-generational gamble. The political life was not merely an option, but a mandatory vocation, a cruel twist of fate that forced the handsome, scholarly, and often detached younger son onto the merciless stage of American politics. This moment marked the true beginning of John F. Kennedy's political career, one built less on personal fervor and more on the quiet, unyielding command of a grieving yet utterly determined father. The political ascent of Jack was thus fueled by a profound sense of survivor's guilt and a deep-seated need to satisfy his father's relentless drive. The transfer was immediate and total. Joe Sr. elevated Jack's existing political career from a side project to the central mission, replacing his comfortable intellectual pursuits with the demanding schedule of a perpetually campaigning candidate. The family narrative was subtly but immediately shifted to frame Jack as the dutiful successor, the torchbearer of the family's patriotic sacrifice. Beyond the dazzling public smile and the image of youthful vigor carefully crafted by the family's public relations machine, John F. Kennedy battled a hidden, chronic landscape of physical ailments that required a secret, complex regimen of drugs and constant medical care throughout his early political rise and his presidency. The public saw a tanned, athletic war hero, the survivor of a PT-109 sinking, but the reality was far removed from this carefully constructed myth. From a young age, Jack suffered from persistent, agonizing back pain, primarily stemming from chronic spondylitis, a debilitating inflammatory condition. This was compounded by Addison's disease, a rare, life-threatening endocrine disorder confirmed in 1947, which Jack required to take daily doses of cortisone and other steroids to manage his condition and prevent life-threatening crises. His medical routine was a closely guarded secret, managed by a select group of trusted physicians who administered a daily cocktail of medications that included painkillers, anti-inflammatories, antispasmodics, and crucially, multiple daily injections of procaine into his back to dull the pain, allowing him to stand, walk, and perform the rigorous demands of a political campaign. He often wore a custom-made, heavily braced back support, which, ironically, sometimes prevented him from bending naturally. This constant physical struggle was a testament to his sheer willpower, but also an extraordinary vulnerability. The fact that a candidate for the highest office was constantly managing multiple severe, life-threatening, and debilitating conditions was an electoral risk deemed too catastrophic to ever reveal. Thus, the charming, smiling figure on the campaign trail was in fact an individual constantly teetering on the edge of collapse, sustained by a secret pharmaceutical arsenal, a fact that makes his endurance through the 1960 campaign all the more remarkable. The elaborate deception extended to the public record, where any mention of Addison's disease was meticulously suppressed or reclassified as a more benign ailment. The logistics of maintaining this secret while traveling and campaigning were immense, adding a profound layer of isolation to his life. He lived a double life, the public image of robust health and the private reality of chronic, debilitating pain and reliance on powerful, often mood-altering drugs.
The single televised debate against Richard Nixon on September 26, 1960, shattered decades of American political tradition and propelled a Catholic to the presidency, fundamentally altering the calculus of political campaigning forever. This was the first ever televised presidential debate, yet it immediately and dramatically demonstrated the supremacy of image over substance in the new age of mass media. Kennedy arrived meticulously prepared and polished, tan, well-rested, and dressed in a dark suit. Nixon, conversely, was recovering from a knee infection, refused makeup, and appeared sickly, nervous, and shifty under the harsh studio lights. The vast, critical disparity in the audience's perception immediately revealed the dichotomy. Those who listened on radio,
often felt Nixon had won, finding his policy answers more detailed. However, the estimated 70 million Americans who watched on television overwhelmingly concluded that Kennedy had prevailed. They saw a confident, vigorous, and presidential young man contrasting starkly with Nixon's sweating, pale, and seemingly defensive demeanor. The visual medium had imposed a new, nonverbal standard of judgment. It was no longer enough to be smart or experienced. One had to look presidential. This single event, more than any other, demolished the old model of whistle-stop tours and dry rhetorical speeches, establishing the television screen as the most important political battleground. For Kennedy, it was the moment that decisively neutralized the religious question, that of a Catholic in the White House, by presenting an image of such modern secular charisma that his denomination faded into irrelevance, allowing the new irresistible force of television politics to carry him past his opponent and into the highest office. The event proved that performance and presentation were now co-equal partners with substance. Kennedy's team had anticipated this, advising him to look directly into the camera, lending an intimacy and authenticity that Nixon failed to capture.
The revolutionary call to action, hidden within John F. Kennedy's soaring inaugural address on January 20, 1961, was a demand for personal, proactive civic engagement and a global, moral reckoning, succinctly captured by the now immortal phrase, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." This address was a masterpiece of rhetorical idealism that served as a generational clarion call. The new frontier was not simply a domestic policy agenda, but a philosophical challenge to the American people to embrace sacrifice, public service, and the struggle for human liberty. The speech masterfully avoided dwelling on specific legislative programs, choosing instead to define a moment, a mood, and a mission. It was a promise to the world that the United States would stand as the uncompromising guardian of human rights and self-determination, offering aid to those people in the huts and villages of half the globe. Crucially, this address ignited a generation because it spoke directly to the idealism and impatience of the young, offering them a tangible way to participate in a grand moral enterprise, moving beyond the complacency of the post-war era. It directly inspired the creation of the Peace Corps, which was established shortly thereafter. The new frontier became the shorthand for this revolutionary spirit, an invitation to tackle the unknown areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered pockets of ignorance and prejudice. In its brevity and profound moral appeal, the address became a defining document of 20th-century political thought, setting a tone of optimism and youthful vigor, challenging Americans to be citizens of the world and agents of change. The speech achieved this global resonance by speaking in universal, almost biblical terms, using concepts of liberty and the shared burden of a new generation facing a dark and uncertain world. The rhythmic cadence, crafted for television, lent it an urgency that resonated deeply. The marriage of Jack Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier on September 12, 1953, was not merely a union of two individuals. It was a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar media spectacle meticulously engineered by Joe Sr. to forge the enduring, idealistic, and politically potent myth of Camelot. Jackie, with her impeccable style, intellectual curiosity, and French-inspired elegance, was the perfect complement to Jack's political persona. She was the quintessential American princess, embodying a sophisticated European glamour that instantly elevated the Kennedy brand above the provincial traditional image of Boston Irish Catholicism. Joe Sr. understood that the new age of politics would be defined by television and image, and Jackie was the ultimate visual asset. Their high-profile wedding was a society event that garnered national headlines, effectively transforming a political contender into a cultural icon. The marriage immediately introduced an aura of high culture, sophistication, and romance that captivated the American electorate. This spectacle was about the creation of a narrative. Camelot, the nickname later applied to the Kennedy White House, was an entire ecosystem of youth, hope, idealism, and cultural renaissance. It was a calculated distraction from the reality of Jack's chronic health issues and his rumored extramarital affairs, an idealized, almost fictionalized version of American power. The couple's move into the White House was treated as the arrival of a new, optimistic royal family. This media masterpiece, the coupling of the ambitious politician and the elegant socialite, was the final, critical piece of the Joe Sr. puzzle, ensuring that the Kennedy ascendancy would be remembered not just as a political event, but as a glittering, cultural moment in American history, forever locking the image of the handsome young president and his wife into the collective national psyche. Her presence added a crucial layer of cultural depth to Jack's profile, helping counter the lingering anti-Catholic sentiment. The Camelot myth was further solidified during her famous televised tour of the White House, reinforcing the idea that the new administration represented a renaissance of American taste and purpose. This was the ultimate victory of image management. The reality of a marriage, often strained by infidelity, was replaced by a perfect, shimmering fantasy projected onto the world stage.
John F. Kennedy's immediate, disastrous misstep came swiftly in the form of the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, a profoundly humbling event that taught the young president a brutal and necessary lesson about the limitations of U.S. power, the necessity of questioning expert advice, and the devastating consequences of political treachery. The operation, a CIA-planned, Eisenhower-era scheme to overthrow the communist regime of Fidel Castro, was a political inheritance that Kennedy reluctantly approved. The military and intelligence brass presented the plan as a low-risk, high-reward operation. However, the advice was riddled with fundamental flaws. The landing site was poorly chosen, the Cuban people did not rise up, and Kennedy vetoed critical air support. The entire operation collapsed within 3 days, resulting in over 100 deaths and the capture of more than 1,000 invaders. This humiliation was total and public, a profound embarrassment on the world stage that solidified Castro's power. For Kennedy, the failure was a devastating education. It shattered his inherited faith in the infallibility of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Central Intelligence Agency, organizations he correctly identified as having provided him with dangerously biased and flawed counsel. The aftermath led to the swift dismissal of CIA Director Allen Dulles and the adoption of a deep, abiding skepticism toward monolithic inherited advice. It was a critical turning point that forced him to realize that the most important quality of a president was his ability to critically challenge and ultimately take full responsibility for every decision. The Bay of Pigs was a crucible of his presidency, a moment of profound failure that ironically forged the stronger, more independently thinking leader. The immediate result was a crisis of confidence in the intelligence community, leading to a complete overhaul
of his decision-making process. During 13 days of terrifying secrecy in October 1962, the world stood at the precipice of nuclear war, and it was John F. Kennedy's calculated diplomacy, iron-willed restraint, and deliberate avoidance of a direct military response that ultimately pulled humanity back from the brink of annihilation. The discovery of Soviet ballistic missile sites under construction in Cuba, capable of striking the U.S. mainland, instantly escalated the Cold War to an existential crisis. Kennedy faced overwhelming pressure from the majority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Hawks, to authorize an immediate airstrike, a course of action that virtually guaranteed a Soviet military response. Instead, Kennedy chose a multi-pronged strategy born of the hard lessons learned at the Bay of Pigs. He opted for a naval quarantine, a blockade of Cuba, to prevent the further delivery of military equipment, rather than an act of war. Crucially, he bypassed the most aggressive recommendations of his military advisors, instead relying on a secret, deliberative group of trusted counsel known as the ExComm, Executive Committee of the National Security Council. The restraint displayed during the crisis was a testament to Kennedy's ability to maintain a calm, rational demeanor under the highest pressure. He pursued a delicate, back-channel diplomatic resolution, ultimately striking a secret bargain with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The U.S. publicly agreed not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove obsolescent Jupiter missiles from Turkey, in exchange for the Soviet Union withdrawing its missiles from Cuba. This deliberate, two-track diplomacy, a public show of resolve combined with a private face-saving concession, was a triumph of political and strategic realism. Kennedy's measured use of power, resisting the catastrophic impulse for a preemptive strike, is widely regarded as the most responsible presidential decision in the nuclear age, demonstrating that in the ultimate crisis, restraint is the truest form of strength. He utilized his brother, Robert Kennedy, as a crucial, discreet emissary to communicate directly with the Soviet ambassador. Faced with the tyranny of the Berlin Wall, a stark physical manifestation of the Cold War's division, John F. Kennedy's famous declaration, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner, on June 26, 1963, marked not just a powerful statement of defiance against Soviet aggression, but a subtle yet crucial pivot toward peace and mutual coexistence, predicated on a foundation of strength. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, was a profound embarrassment to the West. Kennedy's visit to West Berlin was a gesture of solidarity designed to boost morale and reaffirm the American commitment to the city's freedom. The massive crowd that greeted him was a powerful testament to the symbolic weight of his presence. His speech, delivered against the backdrop of the wall, was a brilliant piece of rhetoric. The moment of defiance, where he declared that the wall was the ultimate proof of communism's failure, culminated in the declaration, "Ich bin ein Berliner." This statement was an electrifying moment of identification, proclaiming that all free men were spiritually citizens of Berlin, defying the Soviet attempt to isolate and intimidate. However, the subtle pivot lay in the message that followed. Having demonstrated American resolve, Kennedy soon moved to open a dialogue with the Soviets, a strategy that would lead to the limited nuclear test ban treaty just 2 months later. The message was clear. America would never tolerate the oppression. But having affirmed this position from a place of strength, the next step was to reduce the global peril. The speech was the ultimate expression of the dual strategy of the Cold War, deterrence through power and de-escalation through diplomacy.
It used defiance as a foundation from which to negotiate. The emotional impact of the speech was transformative, and yet it was carefully calibrated, offering no military solution to the wall's existence, a pragmatic recognition that forcefully tearing down the structure would risk a wider conflict.
The president who inspired millions with the promise of the new frontier initially adopted a cautious, almost hesitant approach to the civil rights movement, forcing his hand only after violence erupted and the moral necessity of the issue became undeniable and globally visible. Kennedy had won the 1960 election with critical support from the African American community. However, once in office, his political priority was the survival and success of his ambitious domestic and foreign policy agenda. He was acutely aware that any aggressive move on civil rights legislation would immediately alienate the powerful bloc of segregationist Southern Democrats in Congress, effectively dooming his entire legislative package. Therefore, his initial strategy was one of executive action over legislative battle. He appointed African Americans to high-level positions and sent Attorney General Robert Kennedy to enforce desegregation orders in the South, notably at the universities of Mississippi and Alabama. His caution, however, was repeatedly overridden by the moral urgency of events on the ground. The brutal attacks on the Freedom Riders in 1961 and the violent federal interventions required to integrate universities were not his first choice of action, but were unavoidable responses to constitutional crises created by Southern defiance. It was the calculated, nonviolent direct action of civil rights leaders that intentionally created the necessary tension and crisis, forcing the administration to act. Kennedy's hand was ultimately forced not by choice, but by the irrefutable, televised evidence of injustice and the political impossibility of ignoring a movement that was demanding the moral soul of the nation, compelling him to move from a pragmatic political calculation to an essential moral leadership. His early reluctance stemmed from a pragmatic political assessment. He needed Southern Democratic votes to pass vital legislation. The shocking images from Birmingham, Alabama, in May 1963, the sight of police dogs lunging at peaceful marchers and high-pressure fire hoses being turned on children, were the visual catalyst that finally compelled John F. Kennedy to declare the fight for racial equality a moral issue for the nation, marking a decisive shift in his presidency. This was the moment where the strategic political calculus of avoiding Southern Democrats was irrevocably superseded by an overwhelming moral and political necessity. The Birmingham campaign, spearheaded by Martin Luther King Jr., was a deliberate strategy to provoke a violent reaction from Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, knowing that the ensuing confrontation would be impossible for the national media to ignore. The televised images of the brutality, dogs ripping at clothes, water pressure strong enough to roll people down the street, were instantly disseminated across the country and around the world. This was a massive, humiliating public relations disaster for the United States on the world stage. These images forced Kennedy to understand that the issue was no longer merely a legal or political problem, but an untenable moral crisis for the entire nation. On June 11, 1963, following the crisis at the University of Alabama, Kennedy gave a landmark televised address. In this speech, he explicitly reframed the fight for civil rights, stating that it was a question of whether the Negro, or any American, because of his race, is to be denied the equal right to enjoy the life which all of us want. With this declaration, Kennedy fully committed the prestige of his office to the cause, proposing the most comprehensive civil rights legislation the country had ever seen, transforming a political liability into a moral imperative and setting the stage for the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. The visual evidence from Birmingham acted as an undeniable moral indictment. The use of children in the demonstrations, known as the Children's Crusade, amplified the horror and generated widespread sympathy and indignation across the nation.
The audacious goal of landing a man on the moon and safely returning him to Earth before the end of the decade became the ultimate American distraction. a monumental technological triumph that brilliantly masked the deep social divisions and civil unrest roiling the nation during the 1960s. Kennedy announced the Apollo program in a special address to Congress on May 25, 1961, shortly after the Soviet Union had launched the first man into space. This announcement was a calculated, strategic response to Soviet superiority in space, a geopolitical move designed to win the space race and demonstrate the unrivaled technological and economic power of the free world. The Moon program was a massive undertaking, demanding a commitment of over $25 billion and the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers. It became an instantly unifying national purpose, a single, inspiring goal that transcended racial, regional, and political divides. The sheer scale and nobility of the endeavor captured the national imagination, providing a forward-looking, positive narrative of American ingenuity and destiny. By focusing the national conversation and billions of dollars on the limitless new frontier of space, the program provided a powerful, glittering counterbalance to the very earthly and immediate problems of the new frontier at home: the violent fight for civil rights, the looming quagmire in Vietnam, and the persistent problems of poverty and urban decay. The spectacle of the space effort served as a diversionary triumph, allowing the American public and the world to look up at the stars and the future of technology, rather than down at the streets where police dogs and fire hoses were being deployed. It was a masterstroke of political theater that channeled national anxiety into constructive competition, creating a myth of unified purpose even as the social fabric of the nation was beginning to fray. The decision was rooted in the understanding that the Cold War was fundamentally a battle of ideologies and systems.
A seemingly routine motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, instantly and irrevocably turned into the single most shocking and generation-defining event of the 20th century, instantly freezing the image of Camelot in an eternal, tragically unfulfilled moment. The trip to Texas was intended as a political fence-mending exercise, an attempt to unite squabbling factions of the Democratic Party. Kennedy, riding in an open-top limousine alongside his wife Jackie and Governor John Connally, was waving to the ecstatic crowds. This moment of public exposure was transformed into an instant of national trauma at 12:30 p.m. Central Time when shots rang out. The details of the event are indelibly etched into the national memory. The sound of the shots, the sight of the president collapsing, the iconic image of Jackie climbing onto the back of the car, and the grim, urgent motorcade speeding to Parkland Memorial Hospital. The tragedy was amplified by the new ubiquity of television. Within minutes, news reports preempted all scheduled programming, and for the next 4 days, Americans were glued to their screens, sharing a communal experience of grief, shock, and disbelief. The death of the young, charismatic president, who had come to embody a sense of American vitality and idealism, was a psychological rupture for the nation. It was a sudden, violent end to the promise of the new frontier, extinguishing the light of Camelot at its brightest point. The assassination did not just end life, it abruptly terminated a period of optimism, introducing an era of cynicism and doubt into the American psyche. The image of the shining, hopeful Kennedy presidency was instantly fossilized, forever defined not by its ultimate achievements, but by the sheer, devastating shock of its premature and brutal conclusion in Dealey Plaza. The event was a profound national rite of passage, forcing Americans to confront the fragility of power and the random cruelty of violence. Despite the official findings of the Warren Commission, which concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted as a lone assassin, the American public still overwhelmingly believes there was a conspiracy, leaving the final chapter of John F. Kennedy's death forever shrouded in doubt, distrust, and speculation. Decades of subsequent investigations have failed to dislodge this deep-seated public skepticism. Numerous polls conducted over the years have consistently shown that a significant majority of Americans, often reaching between 60 and 80%, reject the single gunman theory. This persistent belief in a conspiracy is fueled by several factors, which, when combined, create an enduring narrative of official cover-up and incomplete truth. First, the rushed and seemingly flawed nature of the initial investigation, coupled with the immediate murder of Oswald by Jack Ruby while in police custody, fueled suspicion that key information was being suppressed. Second, the enduring ambiguities of the physical evidence, most famously the magic bullet theory and the disputes over the direction and number of shots fired, have provided constant fodder for alternative theories. Third, the sheer magnitude of the loss, the tragic death of a beloved leader, made the idea of a lone, unremarkable individual being the sole cause too arbitrary and insignificant for such a monumental event. It seemed more plausible to many that a powerful, sinister force must have been behind it. Finally, the decades of government secrecy and the continuous delay in releasing classified documents have solidified the public's distrust in the government's official narrative. This prevailing belief in a conspiracy is perhaps the greatest political legacy of the assassination, a corrosive distrust of authority and a profound doubt in the ability of government institutions to transparently handle the most critical truths, ensuring that the final, definitive chapter of Kennedy's death remains an open, agonizing question mark in the American historical consciousness.
The profound political and cultural legacy left behind by the idea of Camelot is a paradoxical one. It established a myth of limitless, youthful idealism and political promise that endures precisely because his early death forever defined him by his potential rather than his actual achievements. Kennedy's presidency was brief, just 1,036 days, and his legislative successes were, at the time of his death, modest. Key initiatives, most notably the Comprehensive Civil Rights Act and his major tax cut proposals, were signed into law by his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. Had Kennedy lived and completed a full 2 terms, he would have inevitably faced the brutal, grinding reality of Vietnam, urban riots, escalating racial tensions, and political compromise, all of which would have tarnished the shining image he left behind. The cultural power of Camelot lies in its incompleteness. It became the last moment of pure, unified national optimism before the divisiveness of Vietnam and Watergate fractured the American consensus. His death froze the image of the young family, the calls for public service, the intellectual vigor, and the sense of hopeful possibility in amber. He is remembered less for what he did, and more for what he represented and what he might have done. This legacy of unfulfilled potential became a powerful and enduring benchmark for future presidents, who are still judged against the Kennedy ideal of charisma, intellect, and inspiring vision. Culturally, he became the eternal youth, a symbol of a lost American innocence that, ironically, may have only existed in the myth created around him. The enduring appeal is the tragedy itself, the promise cut short, the possibility violently extinguished, which allows the myth of Camelot to persist as a nostalgic yearning for a time when politics seemed infused with poetry, purpose, and the boundless hope of a new generation. The irony remains that the death that caused so much pain also consecrated his image.